My name is Mishler. I'm a Mellon postdoctoral fellow here in the McNeil Center in the Society of Fellows. I got my PhD from New York University in 2016, this past August. And I'm here at Columbia. I'm affiliated with the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race and the History Department. My dissertation is entitled The Atlantic Origins of Mass Incarceration, Punishment, Abolition, and Racial Inequality. And what it examines is the relationship between the gradual abolition of slavery in the Americas between 1780 and 1888 and the birth of the modern penitentiary during the same period. And I'm interested in the way in which these two processes, one, an abolition of one form of bondage, and the other, the consolidation of a different form of bondage, were related both in terms of the people involved in both projects, but also in terms of the consequences for formerly enslaved people in societies that are transitioning away from slavery, and what the long-term legacies are of that process for understanding contemporary mass incarceration. So one piece I'm working on is a history of what I call enslaved legal theory. And I'm looking at how enslaved people in Jamaica made use of law between the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and the abolition of slavery in 1833. And one of the things that's so striking about it is we tend to think of slavery as this kind of totalizing system, where enslaved people had no rights, they had no ways to petition or avenues of redress. And one of the things I'm trying to show in this article is that there were important changes at the turn of the 19th century that actually opened up avenues for enslaved people to use the very laws that codified them as property to actually challenge the power of masters. And that those actions, as much as the much more written about slave rebellions of 1831, for example, those actions of everyday ordinary slaves taking their claims to court helped bring down slavery. When you look at the problem of freedom, by which I mean that what comes after emancipation was not the freedom to do whatever you want, but it was the freedom to be liberal subjects. And formerly enslaved people had a different vision of what freedom is. And when you look at those problems or contradictions, it's easy to say, oh, that was Parliament imposing that, or that it was sort of neo-slaveholding kinds of governmental regimes. But part of the contradiction is that enslaved people helped to solidify the legal culture that constrained them after emancipation. So it's not a romantic story. It's a story of the ways in which struggles during slavery, even among the enslaved, circumscribed the possibilities of freedom after slavery. Out of my research in this first project, I did a lot of research on abolitionists and who they were and how did they know one another and what were the kind of family and personal connections. And one of the things I stumbled on that was quite interesting was that, the major chocolate manufacturers in England, Cadbury, right, is a Quaker family, an abolitionist family. And they bought another chocolate company in the late 19th century that was also founded by Quakers, abolitionists. And so I think one of my projects is going to be sort of examining why did Quaker abolitionists get involved in the chocolate business? And my hypothesis is that, again, one of the things they had to argue when they're critiquing slavery is, so if we're going to end the slave trade, what can we substitute? Because if you can't substitute another form of commerce, the commerce in human bodies will remain. Being an abolitionist didn't mean you sacrifice being a merchant or making money. The goal was to find a way to be a good businessman and to have a kind of ethical core, an ethical compass. And so there's something that's interesting to me about this relationship between the history of chocolate and slavery. And I think we can bring that into the 20th century again because cacao production in West Africa is now at the heart of conversations about quote-unquote modern slavery. And the other project, which I've done a bunch of research on, is tentatively titled sort of Narco-Capitalism, A Global History. And what I'm interested in is the long durée kind of relationship between narcotics, stimulants, other forms of drugs, and empire and capitalism. I think the other thing about being a Society of Fellows is just the opportunity to plug into all different kinds of events and programming at Columbia University. One example would be the Justice and Education Initiative, which for me has been super excited to participate in. And that's a chance to really work with people who are teaching in prison or teaching individuals who have come home from prison and providing access to higher education to people who have really been sort of victims of failed policy for the last 30 years, right? And not only teaching them, but giving them a space to speak, to write, and to research. And I think that is both cutting edge in terms of sort of academic settings, and it also shows that intellectuals can be sort of at the, if not the vanguard, at least part of, right, a key civil rights issue of our time. You know, it makes me simultaneously excited as an academic, right, to teach beyond the classroom, but also hopeful, because my work can be quite depressing, right? It's a story of what hasn't changed as much as it's a story of what has changed. And unless you're engaging with people who are going through these systems and processes, one can feel very hopeless.